Hello fellow food lovers. Today I will be making Chinese steamed pork patty with salted fish, preserved mustard stem, green olives, and salted duck eggs. You will need 1 pound of ground pork, 20 grams or a small slice of Chinese salted fish, a quarter cup of preserved mustard stem, a quarter cup of green olives, and 2 salted duck eggs. For the seasoning, you're going to need 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 teaspoon of sesame oil, a dash of Chinese white pepper, and 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. Okay, so those are Chinese salted duck eggs. There's 2 kinds of Chinese preserved eggs. One's called century eggs, and they're almost like a black color on the inside. Another is salted duck eggs, and this is what salted duck eggs look like. And the inside, when they're raw, the egg white is runny, and the egg yolk is a kind of a dark orange color almost. So we want to cook the duck eggs to a hard boil. So I put the duck eggs into cold water in a pot, then I turn the heat to high, and then when it comes to a boil, I put the lid on and turn the heat off. And I let it sit for 5 to 8 minutes, and it should be good. So here's the hard-boiled salted duck eggs. I'm going to actually peel them. So there's 2 of them in this recipe. Okay, once they're both peeled, I'm going to cut each egg into quarters. So these 2 duck eggs are going to actually sit on top of the pork patty. They don't have to look perfect. They might crumble a bit on you. So this is Chinese or Cantonese salted fish. It's usually eaten in very small amounts, and it's more like a flavoring agent than a meal. So if people eat it in, say, southern China, they might take a sliver of the fish and they might put it onto rice and cook it as the rice is steaming. That's probably the most common way of eating it. Or they might take a slice of it and put it on top of the raw pork patty, and when the pork patty steams, it also cooks the fish as well. But in this recipe, I'm going to actually mince the salted fish really finely and mix it into the pork mixture. So you want to trim the bony bits and the fish fins off. You can't really eat those. And then you want to cut the meat off the bone, because you won't be using the bone in this recipe. So all you're going to have is just the flesh, and then you're going to mince it really finely. Okay, so I took the fish and I minced it. That's 1 pound of ground pork. So I'm going to add the minced salted fish onto the ground pork. And this is Chinese preserved mustard stem. So it's the thick stem of the mustard, and it's pickled and preserved. So you take a quarter cup of that and you add it to the ground pork as well. It tends to be quite salty, so you might want to rinse it before you add it to the pork if you're into low sodium. Okay, we're going to season the meat now. I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, 1 teaspoon of sesame oil, 1 A dash of Chinese white pepper powder. And a tablespoon of cornstarch. So there's 3 different kinds of Chinese pickled vegetable that you can use for steamed pork patties. What I'm using is the preserved. Okay, so I'm taking chopsticks to mix the ingredients into the ground pork, mixing the seasoning and the salted fish and the preserved vegetables. So there's 3 primary preserved vegetables that you can use to mix into pork patties. The one that I'm using is the preserved mustard stem. You can also get something called choy, M-U-I-C-H-O-Y, and that's preserved mustard green, or the leaf part of the mustard plant. And you can also use preserved radish as well, and that works just as fine. Each gives its own unique flavor. I just use one or the other, don't use them all in one patty. And the Chinese salted fish, it's a kind of a Cantonese specialty. You'll usually find it in a Chinese grocery store in the refrigerated aisles. So you can sometimes buy a piece of salted fish, or you may have to buy the whole fish too. So that whole fish that I had, that's about $20. Okay, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of green olives to this as well. Green olives aren't really a traditional ingredient in Chinese cooking, but I think green olives actually go quite well with pork, and it's actually quite tasty in pork patties. So I'd recommend you give it a try. I think they complement each other, the olives and the pork. Okay, so once you've kind of mixed the ingredients into the ground pork, you want to kind of mix the pork in one direction in a circular manner. So I'm going in a kind of clockwise manner. And what you're kind of doing is developing the texture of the pork. If you go in one direction, the muscle fibers will kind of align in a certain direction, and it'll really improve the texture of the meat, making it more delicious. So I took the mixture and I put it into a glass Pyrex pie plate, and I'm pressing it down so it's flat against the bottom of the dish. And then I'm poking some holes in the top so I can actually set the slices of hard-boiled salted duck egg on top. So in traditional Chinese cooking, I guess maybe 1 or 2 generations ago, I remember my grandmother would do this, is instead of buying ground pork, they would actually take a piece of pork, cut it into chunks, and they would take 2 cleavers and they would chop it into ground pork, basically with the 2 cleavers kind of going alternating like drumsticks on a drum. So that's how they made a traditional steamed pork patty back then. But now people just buy ground pork, and I would recommend using lean ground pork, but if you can't find lean ground pork, the regular grind of ground pork is good as well. Okay, so I have the wok on high heat, and I added about 4 cups of water there. I'm going to use that to steam the pork patty. So there's a little rack that I put in the bottom of the wok that I can set the dish on, and it keeps the pie plate from sitting in the water. Okay, so I'm going to set the pie plate on top of the rack in the wok. And then you need a cover that would cover the wok that won't touch the sides of the pie plate. So I have a mixing bowl that's just the right size to sit over the wok that won't touch the sides of the pie plate. Because if it's touching the sides, then when the water steams, it'll run up the top of the cover, and it'll kind of run down and go into the pork patty and kind of saturate with water, and you don't want that. Okay, so it takes about 15 to 20 minutes on high heat to steam the pork patty until it's done. So this is about 18 minutes now. So I took the cover off, and this is a handy little gadget that you could get in Chinese grocery stores for removing pie plates or dishes from a steaming rack. It looks like a 3-fingered claw, and that's how it works basically. You can do that without burning your fingers. Okay, so I turned the heat off, and this is how you test the pork patty to see if it's done. You press down on the surface. If it has a bounce, if it feels firm, it's done. If it has give to it, like it feels like raw ground pork, then it's not done. If it has bounce, that means that the meat has kind of cooked and set, and that tells you that it's done when it has that bounce. So this is a traditional way of presenting the pork patty with salted duck egg slices on top. You can also put slices of salted fish on top as well and use that. And there's different ingredients that you can put inside the pork patty. Besides preserved vegetable, you can put water chestnuts that are chopped up into the pork patty, olives like I have, chopped up green onions. Almost anything can go in there. But for the most part, the most common are preserved vegetables or chopped up water chestnuts. Okay, bon appetit.